Good afternoon. I'm Claire Berry, and it's my pleasure to present the last talk with my collaborator, Bart Devolder. And our talk is going to be unlike all of the other talks we've heard today because it truly was the result of a collaboration that we embarked on when we started this technical study. And I'd like to join the other speakers in thanking Ike Kong and also Malcolm Warner for inviting us into the project to do this technical study, and just to congratulate you on the exhibit because it was very, very well received at the Kimbell. I think it really resonated with our audience, and in fact, the Fort Worth Weekly awarded it Reader's Choice Best Exhibition in a Museum in 2011, which is really a big compliment. And of course, I'd like to thank Larry Feinberg and the staff of the Santa Barbara Museum, especially Rachel Sloan, for making all the arrangements and for the wonderful hospitality. Okay. Well, the years 1910 to 12 represented the most intensive period in the development of Cubism, the revolutionary new form of painting developed by Picasso and George Braque, when the two artists worked together almost inseparably. This fertile period, of course, is the focus of the exhibition at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. And the exhibition offered a fresh opportunity to reassess Picasso and Braque's painting materials and techniques from this period, when they engaged in a dynamic give and take and continually evaluated each other's work. In spite of the vast amount that has been written about Cubism, as well as the number of exhibitions devoted to this work, my colleague Bart Devolder and I found very little literature on the paintings, materials, and techniques of the Cubist artists when we embarked on a technical study of the 1910 to 12 paintings in preparation for this exhibition. We were inspired by John Richardson's influential article, Crimes Against the Cubists, written some 30 years ago, and took this article as a point of departure. This afternoon, I will primarily address the question of artist intentions, including issues of surface, format, restoration, condition, and framing, while Bart Devolder will discuss issues of the artist's creative process and painting materials and technique. Describing these years when the two artists worked together so closely, Braque said that they were like two climbers roped together on a mountain, and Picasso even referred to Braque affectionately as his wife. In reality, their relationship was based on a spirit of collaboration as well as rivalry. The work produced through this artistic collaboration promoted a radical rethinking about painting, as together they created some of the most challenging and enigmatic paintings of the 20th century. The impact of this groundbreaking new style, called Cubism, continues to exert its influence well into our own century. For our research, we read the artist's letters and carefully studied photographs such as these, which provided crucial evidence of the artist's tools and materials, as well as works in progress. It should be pointed out, however, that these photographs were staged. The photograph of Braque in particular looks composed. As he strikes a contemplative pose, we can examine what types of brushes he used from those he reverently holds in his hands. His studio, which includes a number of carefully arranged paintings, both framed and unframed, including rectangular as well as oval canvases, appears particularly tidy compared to Picasso's. In this photograph, Picasso poses in a defiant stance, smoking a pipe, directly confronting the camera. And by contrast to Braque's tidy studio, Picasso's paintings are stacked more haphazardly, and there are cans of paint and scraps of paper littering the floor. But we can examine a range of stretcher sizes and canvases and discover canvases that he recycled, turning the earlier abandoned composition around to the reverse. I think you can see down there. We also learned a great deal about the artist's creative process, as well as the condition of their works, from a direct examination of the paintings themselves. In the summer of 2010, Bart and I traveled to several museums to examine firsthand numerous paintings by Picasso and Braque from the period 1910 to 12, including most of the paintings included in the present exhibition. And today, as I said, I will discuss artist intentions, surface, format, and restoration and framing. The Kimbell Art Museum owns two masterworks from this period, The Braque, Girl with a Cross, 1911, is preserved in pristine condition. It is unlined and unvarnished, providing a touchstone for how a Cubist painting surface should appear. The Picasso Man with a Pipe, 1911, on the other hand, an oval composition has undergone a significant change since it left Picasso's studio. At some point, the original tacking edges were trimmed, and it was lined to the present rectangular canvas. This is a lining canvas here. The exposed corners of the lining canvas were painted with a taupe-colored paint, which is now actively flaking, raising questions about how the painting should be presented and framed. The oval painting was also signed on the front here, which was unconventional for a Cubist painting of this period, when Picasso and Braque were consistently signing only the reverses of their paintings, seeking a more anonymous form of painting. I actually have to correct that because as I was listening to the other excellent papers this morning, I was jotting down other examples of Picasso paintings signed on the front. So two that I wrote down were Girl with a Mandolin from MoMA, which he signed in the lower left, and The Dressing Table of 1910, which he signed in the upper left. One of the primary goals of our technical study was to determine Picasso's original intentions regarding the format of Man with a Pipe, so that we could make an informed decision about the possible restoration or reframing of the Kimbell's painting. As the Kimbell's Picasso demonstrates, the condition of many Cubist paintings we examined raised significant questions about artist's intentions regarding surface, format, and framing. And here I'm showing you photographs of Picasso and Braque posing in Braque's military reserve uniform. So to pick up on the theme that others have touched on, there was, I think, a lot of humor and playfulness in their collaboration. I think these photographs are hysterical. These photographs were taken in 1911 at the height of Picasso and Braque's artistic collaboration, and reflect the painters' attitudes about artistic identity. They show the artists posing for each other in Braque's military uniform, revealing that sometimes the artists even dressed alike. And as an aside, I'd like to point out that they're seated next to this cafe table with a rope border and fringe, which we've also seen details of that appear in some of their Cubist works, such as the beautiful still life from Oberlin that we saw this morning by Picasso, The Glass of Absinthe. As Braque recalled, in the early days of Cubism, Pablo and I were engaged in what we felt was a search for an anonymous personality. We were inclined to efface our own personalities in order to find originality. The artist's dream of creating an impersonal style. Picasso stated, "We didn't sign our canvases because we felt the temptation, the hope of anonymous art, not in its expression, but in its point of departure. We were trying to set up a new order, and it had to express itself through different individuals. Nobody needed to know that this was so-and-so who had done this or that painting." Of course, he contradicted himself in his actual practice. Other evidence of Picasso and Braque attempting to efface their own personalities could be seen in the amusing nicknames they called each other. They famously referred to each other as the Wright brothers. Wilbur was Braque, Orville was Picasso. And in 1912, Picasso frequently used the nickname Weiberg, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, for Braque when he was making paper sculptures. The artist's fascination with the American Wild West inspired yet another nickname. Braque encouraged both Picasso and Apollinaire to think about the Wild West after the arrival of Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show in Paris in 1905. This event was followed by the publication of the dime novel Buffalo Bill's Boy Pard in France in 1907-9. Picasso became fascinated by Westerns and Buffalo Bill, and he and Apollinaire called Braque Notre Pard, a term they had picked up from American adventure stories in which Colonel Buffalo Bill Cody referred to his friend as my pard. In the late spring of 1911, Picasso executed the painting Buffalo Bill. And later that summer, when Picasso and Braque worked together in Céret, Picasso wondered if an American girl who had written and wanted to visit him, who was the daughter of an art critic named Bill, might in fact be the daughter of Buffalo Bill. I mean, I can just imagine them having this discussion. I think it's very funny. And this map of France shows all the main cities where Picasso lived and worked, and I'm highlighting here the town of Céret in the southwest of France, where the two artists lived together for three weeks in the summer of 1911. That summer, Picasso took over the second floor of Maison Delacroix, a large house with a large garden, and gave one of the rooms to Braque for his use. There, the two artists shut themselves away and worked intensively during a 3-week period in the summer of 1911, where in the evenings they would relax at the local cafe. And about this time, Picasso recalled, almost every evening, either I went to Braque's studio or Braque came to mine. Each of us had to see what the other had done during the day. Although they were together for no more than 3 weeks, the two challenged each other so effectively that, to recall Braque's mountaineering image, they finally reached the summit. It has been suggested that nothing would exceed the feat that they had achieved at Céret when they pooled their extraordinary resources, their separate skills and powers of invention to achieve similarity in their Cubist paintings. We're fortunate in this exhibition that these two paintings from the Metropolitan Museum, one by Picasso, one by Braque, both painted during the summer in Céret, were brought together. We were very lucky at the Kimbell that they could be hung together. And these works represent a moment when the style of the two Cubist painters was almost indistinguishable. Picasso may have sometimes painted like Braque and Braque like Picasso, but both were adamant that they never worked on each other's paintings. However, sometimes in Céret they painted in each other's idiom. Braque's best drawings, it's been suggested, were done when he was closest to Picasso. And from 1910 onwards, the way that Picasso applied paint to canvas became more eloquent and versatile, thanks to Braque's influence. Both Picasso and Braque were consciously turning their backs on Impressionism, in which artists tried to capture their sensations in landscapes and scenes of modern life. The Cubists played down the use of color and eliminated illusionism in their painting, focusing instead on the architectonics of the composition. Picasso and Braque's Cubist paintings consisted almost exclusively of portraits and still lives of their own construction, which they composed entirely in the studio. Above all, the Cubists wanted to make the picture surface an equivalent of reality rather than a representation of reality. And I enjoyed Lisa Foreman quoting Einstein this morning, that the viewer never exits from the reality of the picture. Recalling their dream of creating an impersonal style, it's challenging to tell which of these two paintings created in Céret in the summer of 1911 is by Picasso and which is by Braque. And I'll quickly review some of the similarities and differences in the materials and techniques, and I know Bart will later expand on this comparison in greater detail. As far as similarities, both paintings are executed on fine weave canvas, which you can see in some of the unpainted edges, that has been prepared with a white ground. Very likely the canvases were cut from the same bolt of fabric. Both artists left areas of exposed ground and painted with a neutral palette. They applied thickly textured paint that could be described as impastoed bricks here, which has also been called Signac style, and painted stencil-type letters and words drawn from the bullfighting journal Le Torero. Both paintings are based on center-focused exhibitions with empty corners. Among the differences, Picasso covered the ground layer with an unevenly applied ochre-colored wash. Braque's palette is much warmer, and for the first time, Braque added sand to his paint. And this I find really interesting. It's maybe one of the little discoveries we made, that we found that Braque was adding sand to his paint a little earlier than was previously thought. I think previously it was thought that he adopted this technique in 1912. But in the lower left, and especially looking at the painting under the microscope, we could very clearly see that he included sand. But what's curious is that you could easily miss that. And picking up on Christine Apoggi's remarks, I do think that this is an example of where you really do want to look at Braque's paintings from a very close range to really appreciate what he's doing with the surface. And I think there'll be other examples of that. But in adding sand to his paint, Braque was employing texture as a substitute for color to depict individual forms without the use of illusionism. Another difference is the way that the two artists applied their letters. And I think Picasso, Picasso applied his letters here with varying opacity and in a way that I think almost suggests the letters receding in space. By contrast, Braque's letters appear flat, existing as forms outside of space, and Picasso added curved lines in the lower right that suggest the shape of an oval here, missing in Braque's painting. Following the great Picasso retrospective in 1980, Picasso's biographer John Richardson, shown here hanging Picasso's late works in the recent exhibition at Gagosian, wrote the groundbreaking article, Crimes Against the Cubists, which was an impassioned call to arms regarding the care and preservation of Cubist paintings. Richardson claimed that the surfaces of many Cubist paintings had been unwittingly ruined by well-intentioned but historically ignorant restorers who had subjected these paintings to wax lining and varnishing. Richardson claimed that these varnished surfaces were directly at odds with Picasso and Braque's artistic intentions. He wrote, "To subject these delicate grounds to wax lining and worse, a shine, is as much a solecism as frying a peach." Richardson wrote that it cannot be too strongly and too often emphasized that both Picasso and Braque were adamant that the surfaces of their Cubist paintings be left matte and never in any circumstance be varnished. And in the case of Braque, this also applied to all subsequent work as well. If a shiny passage was required, as it often was, they could always apply locally a lacquer or a glossy house paint, such as Rippolin, to a specific passage. And in this way, they would differentiate between matte and shiny areas. For example, a china jug may be portrayed with a shiny surface. A newspaper perhaps would have a matte surface. And we've already seen an example of Braque attempting to differentiate through texture and the use of sand. These subtle but crucial differences are destroyed if the entire surface is varnished or if the entire painting is impregnated with wax resin, a popular lining adhesive that continued to be used with regularity through most of the 1980s, but is less common today. The illusory depths that varnish enabled traditionally trained artists to emphasize were anathema to Cubists, recalling that Picasso and Braque wanted to make the picture surface the equivalent of reality, not a representation of it. Coats of varnish have falsified the values of one Cubist masterpiece after another. Relining, on the other hand, has often resulted in a flattening of impasto, no less important in Cubist painting, that tends to give the picture surface the uniform smoothness of a formica table. Recalling the artist's use of impasto bricks from the two Céret paintings we just saw, we're reminded of the importance of surface texture in Cubist paintings, which could be considered as sculptures in low relief. Furthermore, the surfaces of Cubist paintings are often encrusted with traces of artist changes or pentimenti, and these passages too can be seriously flattened as the result of insensitive relining. The danger of wax resin lining and varnishing on Cubist paintings was illustrated when one of Braque's own paintings was brought back to him to be signed after relining had obliterated the artist's signature on the back. Braque said, "Look how the blacks jump out at you. The black lines that had formerly served as discrete scaffolding now stood out thanks to the presence of a glossy varnish. Restorers are amazing," said Braque. "They have transformed my guitar into a tambourine." And I'm showing you here a comparison of our unvarnished Braque on the left and the small still life from the Dallas Museum of Art on the right, which you're seeing it here before its recent cleaning at the Kimbell, where it still has a varnish layer on it. And I hope you can, although it's difficult to see this in a PowerPoint presentation, I hope you can appreciate how in the painting that's been varnished, the blacks do look much more saturated, and they're much more emphasized than in the more pastel, dry surface of the unvarnished painting on the left. Richardson suggested that perhaps our eyes have become jaded from seeing too many shiny reproductions in art books, and indeed with Cubist paintings there is no substitute for the direct experience of the works themselves, which this exhibition demonstrates. And as I just said, prior to the exhibition, I was able to clean this painting at the Kimbell, And I'm happy to report that a number of other paintings were cleaned as well, including both the Picasso and Braque from the Met, which were cleaned by Lucy Belloli and Isabelle Duvernois, and the Cleveland Picasso, which was cleaned by Dean Yoder, and the beautiful Picasso from the Menil, which Laura Rivers cleaned. It was very helpful to have these two paintings side by side during the cleaning, because that was the only way I could really gauge when the cleaning of the Dallas picture was really done. I'm showing you here a photograph of the Picasso at the Menil during cleaning, and I thank Laura Rivers for providing this image. It still has a varnish layer on the left, and this red line denotes the boundary between the cleaned area on the right and the uncleaned on the left, and you're seeing the painting in specular light. And I hope you can appreciate the kind of uniformity that this glossy surface coating imparts to the Picasso. And the cleaning of this painting was really a transformation, and it looks just beautiful. It's the beautiful chalky quality of the paint surface it can now be appreciated afresh. After he read our article, our essay in the catalog, Pepe Carmel wrote back with some interesting comments, and as far as, especially regarding Picasso's view towards restoration. And he pointed out this painting to me, which he had just seen in New York, Le Baiser by Picasso from 1931. And we've already heard that when confronted with a lined painting, Braque stated that restorers had converted his painting to a tambourine. Picasso also commented on the condition of his paintings. According to John Richardson, if an early painting developed craquelure, Picasso relished it, as it proved that his works continued to have a life of their own. And this painting, Le Baiser, provides a fascinating addendum to this. One of the paintings in the show, the recent show at the Gagosian, shows the two lovers locked in a violent kiss. Their pink and red heads are silhouetted against the pillow and sheet of their bed, which are covered with thick white paint that seems to have developed a strong pattern of craquelure. But when you look closely at the actual canvas, it becomes clear that most, if not all, of the craquelure is in fact trompe-l'oeil, consisting of narrow black lines that Picasso has painted onto the white paint, sometimes taking advantage of the ridges and valleys of its thick impasto. To summarize, if a painting didn't develop craquelure on its own, Picasso sometimes provided it. So I would like to thank Pepe Carmel for that observation. In their Cubist paintings of 1910 to 12, Picasso and Braque both experimented with a variety of formats and canvas sizes. That Braque continued to stretch and prime his own canvases to his own specifications is evident on the reverse of Girl with a Cross. The uneven scissors-cut tacking margins attest to the fact that the artist stretched the canvas himself. As we have discussed, typically Picasso and Braque only signed the reverses of their Cubist paintings because they were inclined to efface their individual personalities. One of the great benefits of the unlined pictures is being able to examine the artist's signatures on the reverses, as well as evidence of their dealer conviler's labels and stencils. Braque's Soda from the Museum of Modern Art, painted in the spring of 1912, represents the one and only Cubist tondo. Why did Braque abandon this circular format? The round format promotes the reading of the painting as a table, similar to the format of the typical Parisian café table. During our examination of the paint surface under the microscope at MoMA, we discovered that Braque applied a warm ochre imprimatura over the ground layer, and that he treated the entire surface of this imprimatura with faux bois, effectively converting the round canvas to a tabletop. And again, to Christine Poggi's comment, it's not obvious. You really have to look closely, but once you do, you realize anywhere there's this exposed warm ochre imprimatura, you see that it's been treated with fake wood technique. I think this is a very interesting example of how painting techniques, they carry meaning in a conceptual sense. Picasso and Braque's use of the oval format has been called one of the most significant and least discussed characteristics of Cubist paintings. And here you see a picture of Picasso in his studio with, and we're seeing the reverse of an oval canvas where he obviously stretched the canvas himself. In the spring of 1910, Braque painted his first oval canvas, Woman with a Mandolin, and by the end of 1912, he would have completed more than 24 oval still life paintings. Why did Braque adopt this format, which in many ways was considered outdated and associated with earlier, more academic painting? Braque wrote, "With the oval, I rediscovered the sense of the horizontal and the vertical." Pepe Carmel observed that Picasso and Braque usually worked outwards from their central motifs, extrapolating the grid from elements of the motif. They didn't see it as connected to the frame, and therefore often stopped short before reaching the edges, whether painting in a rectangular or oval format. Here we see two examples of Picasso and Braque using the oval and the vertical format for portraiture. An interesting aspect is the use of the vertical format oval for portraiture in that it suggests the shape of a mirror. The Cubists also used the oval canvas in the horizontal format for still lifes. In these cases, the use of the horizontal sets up the idea of a table. The oval formats that Picasso and Braque adopted often came in different shapes and sizes. Some were more rounded and others were narrower. And of course, there's a long-standing tradition in the use of the vertical oval format for portraiture, going back to the Rococo period in paintings such as Boucher's portrait of the Marquise de Pompadour, and even in the neoclassical period in the work of Ingres, such as in his portrait of Madame Rivière from 1806. And artists such as Chardin and Anne Valier-Coster, working in the French Academy, adopted the oval format for still life paintings, where the composition is necessarily concentrated at the center of the canvas. In using the oval canvas, the Cubist artists retrieved a format from earlier traditions that, but it's interesting to point out, I think, that even as late as 1887, Van Gogh adopted this format for painting a reclining figure of a nude from the Barnes collection. The oval stretchers purchased by Picasso and Braque for their Cubist paintings were more expensive than rectangular ones, underscoring the fact that this format was an intentional choice on their part. We can see here that Picasso signed architect's table discreetly on the reverse in accordance with the Cubist normal practice. We also see the stencil and labels of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, the artist dealer. Normally, Kahnweiler established the price of Picasso's Cubist paintings according to their stretcher size. However, exceptionally in this case, Kahnweiler raised the price after Picasso completely reworked architect's table. And here's just a picture of Kahnweiler and a typical label that we see on the reverse of the Cubist paintings that he handled. We are fortunate that the exhibition features such an important example of an unlined oval canvas by Braque, Still Life with Glasses and Bottle from 1912, from the Robert and Mercedes Eichholz collection. It retains its original stretcher and the by now familiar artist's signature on the reverse. As we've already seen in the case of the unlined Braque painting at the Kimbell, the irregular scissor-cut tacking edges suggest that Braque stretched the canvas himself. But the exhibition also includes two oval canvases by Picasso that have been removed from their original stretchers and lined onto rectangular canvases. In addition to the Kimbell Man with the Pipe, previously discussed, Picasso's Bottle, Glass, and Fork, 1911-12, from the Cleveland Museum of Art, had also been removed from its original stretcher and lined to a rectangular canvas. But unlike the Kimbell painting, the Cleveland's Picasso preserved its original tacking edges, which you see here were flattened before it was lined. Prior to the exhibition, Dean Yoder removed the painting from the lining canvas and restretched the painting on an oval stretcher and reframed it, so we can enjoy that now back in its original format. And I would like to thank him for providing the photograph as well as conservation reports. As a result of our research for the technical study, Bart and I made an important rediscovery in the files of the Museum of Modern Art about the origins of the Kimbell Picasso. Pepe Carmel had previously identified the oval canvas in the lower right of the Herbin photograph, shown here, as an earlier state of the Kimbell Picasso. Carmel suggested that most likely Picasso started the canvas as a still life, perhaps in a horizontal format, and then heavily reworked it, transforming it into a portrait and into a vertical format painting. Indeed, in our examinations, we found numerous examples of Pentimenti in Picasso's Cubist paintings, many more than in Braque's. And I thought that was interesting that this seems to be paralleled in their printmaking practice. And I couldn't help but think that there were parallels between the multiple states of printmaking that we saw in the cliché Conweiler print and Picasso's transformation of this picture and perhaps transformation of Architect's Table as well. But why would Picasso transform a still life into a figure? Why not simply paint a figure? Perhaps this is a mystery that cannot be solved, but this example of Picasso's radical transformation of the Kimbell's painting provides a window into his remarkable powers of imagination. In the case of Picasso's Violin, Sheet Music, and Bottle, 1914, from the Barnes Foundation, we found an interesting example of an oval canvas cut into an irregular shape that had been mounted on a rectangular canvas prepared with an off-white priming. But in this case, it appears that the lining was carried out prior to the painting's sale by Conweiler. Perhaps this represents a rare example of lining sanctioned by Conweiler, if not by Picasso himself. We don't know for sure. The reason I think Picasso might have approved it is because he once reprimanded his dealer, "You will abide by my judgment as to whether a painting is finished or not." Understanding Picasso and Braque's intentions with regard to framing, something that we've talked a lot about this morning, is an area that merits further investigation. And now I'm talking about framing in the sense of really wooden frames. And I think tomorrow will be a very interesting exercise for all of us to see the paintings in the galleries and actually discuss their physical frame. But our preliminary findings would suggest that the manner in which many Cubist paintings are currently framed is at odds with what the artist may have wished. When discussing the Céret paintings after they arrived in Paris, Picasso relayed the following instructions about framing. Quote, "Don't put black frames on these paintings. They must have gold." Our examination of the surface of Architect's Table under the microscope at the Museum of Modern Art revealed remnants of gold leaf embedded in the paint along the edges, suggesting the painting was placed in a gold frame before the paint had initially dried. The dealer, Paul Rosenberg, later codified Picasso's preference for gold frames. And with Picasso's assent, the dealer routinely framed Picasso's paintings in his gallery stock with rather gaudy gold frames. These remained the norm for Picasso framing until about 1989, when Bill Rubin framed much of the work in the Picasso and Braque exhibition with darker frames of a Spanish character. Indeed, many people probably referred these dark Spanish frames. But it's still important for us to understand that darker frames were probably not what Picasso and Braque would have originally chosen for their Cubist paintings. Braque was less specific than Picasso about frame choices. However, we can glean some insights from photographs of the artist in his studio. As we can see, one of the frames, as Conweiler noted in one of his later essays, Braque liked reverse profile frames that push the canvas forward instead of setting it into a recess. I think you can see that here. And again, I'd like to thank Pepe Carmel for that reference. This type of frame reinforced the object quality of the painting and also echoed the projective reverse perspective structure of Braque's and Picasso's Cubist compositions. Such frames, which were essentially cornice frames, had the pieces turned around so that they projected inwards instead of outwards, and they were long known as Braque frames in the framing trade. We can also find evidence of original frames in Picasso's studio photographs, including, again, this photograph of Herbin in Picasso's studio, where we can see a gold frame with spandrels designed for an oval painting. Picasso's violin from 1912 from the Kroller-Müller Museum retains its original oval stretcher. We don't know for certain that this is the original frame, but judging from the Herbin photograph, it would appear to be the type of gold frame with oval spandrel that Picasso might have preferred. This blurry photograph provides a rare view of an installation of a Picasso exhibition from the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in the early 20th century, where the Kimbell's Man with a Pipe can be seen in the gold rectangular frame to the left. And again, oops, interesting that it too has the spandrels. An installation view of the Picasso exhibition at the Kunsthaus Zurich in 1932 also provides evidence of earlier frame choices for Picasso's paintings, where we can see a preference for gold frames. Finally, and this painting deserves the most valuable painting award for the day because we've shown it so many times, Picasso's oval oil on canvas painting, Still Life with Care Chaining, from 1912, is famous for its inclusion of the first collage elements in Cubism, piece of oilcloth printed to imitate wicker, and the rope frame. The rope frame may allude to the tasseled borders of the 19th century cafe table, or perhaps the use of rope to frame souvenir mirrors found in French port towns. In any case, it provides tangible evidence of Picasso's preoccupation with framing, a Cubist composition. And I was thinking again about this painting with some of the remarks that were made earlier today, and two things occurred to me. The first thought was the color of the rope is, in fact, gold. I thought that was interesting. And two, when we were listening to commentary about how this painting could be seen perhaps horizontally as well as vertically, with this lightweight frame, you could actually imagine holding this in your hand or maybe placing it on a table. So I think it puts the painting in an interesting category. And with that, I would like to pass the podium to Bart Devolder. Thank you.
Can you hear me like that? Is it okay? All right, well, thank you for staying a little bit longer. I know it's been a long day. But first of all, thank you, Claire. In this part of the lecture, I will take you on a virtual tour, so to speak, through the actual painting process of Picasso and Braque. And we're trying to understand their materials and procedures. It was actually another goal of our research. In order to do this, we actually used published and unpublished sources. We carried out a close examination of paintings in several museums, as well as a series of historic reconstructions, which were shown in a special conservation room in the Kimbell Art Museum venue of this show. I will be talking a lot about Picasso, who was more outspoken of his working methods, which gives a false impression that Picasso was the more knowledgeable one in regards to paint materials and procedures. I think the opposite is true. We know that Braque was the more hands-on artist, often grinding his own pigments and stretching his own canvas, both chores Picasso had little patience for, and he preferred to purchase them ready-made from one of his Parisian color merchants. So here in this talk, I'll be following, as Claire and I did in the essay, the basic buildup of a canvas painting, as is shown in this diagram. I'm sure most of you know how a painting looks like, but it helps understanding the structure of my talk here. So first, we have the stretcher. And as Claire already mentioned, stretchers can have and show very important information, and this can get lost when they are replaced, which unfortunately happened quite a lot in the 80s, especially 1980s, that is. In the slides, you can see stacks of stretchers in the Picasso studio. We've seen them before, but isolated, you can focus a bit more on them. And in the beginning of the 20th century in France, artists had a choice of several standardized stretchers from several manufacturers. For example, in this slide, we can see the standard size stretchers that Bourgeois & Cie had to offer in this table I'm talking about. It's probably too small letters to read. But these stretchers were actually purchased by Picasso and Braque through their Parisian color merchants, such as Lefebvre and Foinet. The vocabulary of this numbering system was well used and understood. Basically, there were three basic rectangular shapes: figure, paysage, and marine, figure, landscape, and seascape. And they also offered round and oval types. By the time that we're examining in this exhibition, so the 19 teens, the custom-made stretchers were gaining much more popularity as well. Picasso and Braque often used the standard numbering system in the letters to their dealer Kahnweiler. For example, Picasso wrote to Kahnweiler on 4th of July 1912 about a new canvas he'd just begun. Quote, approximately a 60 seascape, end quote. And Braque also wrote to Kahnweiler on 18th of September 1911, quote, I am continuing the woman reading, which I am executing on a 60 canvas, end quote. So yeah, you can see this is what these labels, if they are still there, look like. So we have these numbers that correspond to these numbers, and the F in this case would correspond to figure. Their dealer Kahnweiler even used a numbering system, as Claire already mentioned, to price Picasso's paintings, and this we can find in the contract Picasso signed on December 18, 1912. So you see the contract here. So for example, 500 francs would get you a size 20, meaning a 73 by 60 centimeter painting, and 3,000 francs for a size 60, which would be 130 by 97 centimeters. Other supports, such as panel, are extremely rare in this period, and as far as we found, there's only 2 by Picasso, and we didn't really find any by Braque. From documentary evidence, we know that both Picasso and Braque purchased ready-to-paint or pre-stretched canvases, as well as the separate elements to make their own, as we saw in the previous slide with all the stretchers. And we can also see this gigantic roll of canvas in Picasso's studio. And their preferred canvas was a very, very fine linen. You can see it maybe better in these details. It's a very, very fine linen. As we have already seen, Picasso and Braque were very close in their Céret period. And this can also be said from their materials that were used. And I think it's very clear in these two details that actually the canvas looks extremely identical. And if you count a canvas thread, something conservators like to do, in a square centimeter, we have in both cases 32 horizontal and 24 vertical ones. And this is kind of an interesting thing, and there is a rather new way of examining this, so we no longer have to count. If you've done it once, it's really annoying. This is a new computerized thread counting research project that has been jump-started with the Van Gogh Museum and the Rice University in Houston. And what they do is you scan an X-ray from a painting, and a mathematical algorithm does actually do the counting for you. And what it does, it creates these maps of the canvas, and you can actually overlay them or make them match. And that's what's been going on with Van Gogh for almost 3 years now, and they've been actually able to link paintings that were once attached on one roll or one bolt, as you see here. And as you can imagine, these people have been really, really, their phone is always ringing. And after Van Gogh, they're moving on to Vermeer, and I'm sure many other artists will follow. And I think this would be a very interesting case for especially these 1911 paintings for Picasso and Braque to see whether they were actually from the same roll or bolt of canvas. Would be just an interesting fact to know, I think. So in order to paint on canvas, it is a good idea to have a preparation or a ground layer. Sometimes these grounds were already applied when the artist obtained the canvases, whether as a roll or pre-stretched, but occasionally Picasso and Braque applied their grounds themselves. These grounds were mostly thinly applied, white grounds that revealed much of the fine weave texture. 2 different types of grounds were common with the commercially prepared canvases, meaning the ones they bought already pre-stretched or the big rolls that were already prepared. So one is lisse, or a very smooth texture, like this one, and the other one is agrin, or the rough texture, and that's the other slide. And then here we can see again the reverse of 2 Braque canvases showing the ground that actually seeped through the canvas. You can see these puddles of ground. So that's, I think, is an indication that the ground was applied rather liquidy and thin, that it seeped straight through before it dried. And as Claire already mentioned, the very uneven tacking edges, especially the Kimbell one, are, we think, an indication that Braque stretched especially this one himself, and probably this one too. Some scholars have argued that sometimes the artist sanded these ground layers down to have a more absorption of the oil, the binding media of the paint, and that would then result in a much more matte surface. In some cases, Picasso and Braque applied an imprimatura layer, as Claire already discussed in regards with soda. This imprimatura layer is an overall colored layer applied over the entire surface of the painting before painting the composition. So the next step in the creative process is the underdrawing. Both Picasso and Braque seem to have almost always used charcoal in this period. The underdrawing can be seen in the unpainted areas. This might be hard to see, but it helps if you have a microscope, so that's what it would look like. Or you can also very clearly see them in unfinished paintings, such as this one. And charcoal, I think, is a perfect medium for an underdrawing style that was very organic, with lots of changes. And it's not really known whether or not these drawings were had a fixed layer or a fixative put upon them before painting, because I don't know if you ever worked with charcoal. If you start painting on top of it, it just starts smudging in your paint. And especially with the lighter paints, as you will see later, as they mostly started with the lighter ones, it would become really annoying, I think. And during our research, we also saw some paintings that are very faint painted lines. These are here, that are covering some of these charcoal lines. So I wonder whether that could be like a next step. So the initial step would be the charcoal drawing, and then as reworking and fixing at the same time, they would both use these thin layers of paint. Excuse me. So we also know from one instance that Picasso asked his fellow artist Juan Gris to fix the drawings of some unfinished paintings prior to shipment. So in a letter from Picasso to his dealer, Kahnweiler, dated May 20th, 1912, quote, "You'll have to make a package of the canvas rolled up at Rue Ravignan and the panels and send them here to me. The canvases at Rue Ravignan, which are only drawn in charcoal, the violin too, you should have fixed by Juan Gris," end quote. So here you see, this is not Picasso's fixed the bottle. So how it works is, this is the spray diffuser. You put this end in your mouth and you just blow in it, and the fixative that's in here just gets misted over the charcoal drawing, and therefore it would avoid the actual smudging. So this is the underdrawing phase, that is the step of the painting process where I started my reconstructions, and this is something I like to do. I choose to freely copy a fragment from the DMA's Braque still life with bottles and glasses, which was in the lab anyway, because Claire was working on it to clean it, as she discussed earlier. So what I understand personally under historic reconstructions, it's not, starting here in the upper left corner and just copying it. It's really trying to understand how the buildup of the painting worked. And it's not an excuse, but the result should not necessarily be an exact copy. It's more the concept behind it, how they would have built it up. And it really helped us, I think, in our article writing as well, to understand and have new questions while we were working. Once the overall composition or framework was in place, it was time to actually start painting. And we have several letters from Braque and Picasso that mention some of their painting materials. An example of these letters is from Picasso and is dated May 24, 1912, and he's writing from Céret and asks Kahnweiler to send the following items from both his studios, quote, "They are in the large armoire and on the workshop table. Send me the tubes of white, ivory black, burnt sienna, emerald green, Verona green, ultramarine blue, ochre, umber, vermilion, cadmium dark, or rather cadmium yellow. I prefer to have all my paints here. Send me only 3 or 4 tubes of each of the colors, but send me all the white. And do not forget to send me a bottle of cicative and a packet of charcoal crayons," end quote. This quote gives us plenty of information about the materials he used. The things that were not mentioned we can deduct from looking at the paintings or photographs of the studio. For example, in these details, you can see some of the brushes Picasso and Braque used. And yes, Claire said some of these photos are very likely staged, but still, these brushes are real, and so are these. And in combination of the photos and the actual paintings, we can at least differentiate the 3 common types of brushes which I used here to paint these three examples. So we have the filbert brush, which has a rounded tip, the flat brush, which obviously has a flat tip, and then we have round brushes, which has a more pointed tip. In a letter from Picasso to Braque dated the 5th of July 1911, discussing the different steps of applying paint, it is very helpful in understanding the painting process. Quote, for the new painting, very liquid to start with, and Signac-style methodological treatment only at the end, end quote. What this really means we can see in these two unfinished paintings on the screen. And Picasso encourages Braque to start very liquid, meaning a highly diluted paint, which very likely was an oil paint diluted with turpentine. And so I think these paintings look very interesting, and I had a hard time describing them, but thanks to Pepe, who wrote us, as Claire mentioned, after we sent him the article, he came up with this great phrase that he coined. He calls them the albino state versions. And I think it's really what they are. It's, you know, you can see still this charcoal underdrawings here, and then they just start with this very dilute, mostly, they're kind of like Morandi still lifes. They're always gray and browns, and I know that's how they end up too, but they're very bleached out looking. And I think that's how they go. So in the next step, the painter applies more and more layers, and sometimes they waited until the previous layer was dry. And Braque seems to have been less coherent in his build-up, whether Picasso seems to have worked more from the center, going outward. I think this is an example where you can very clearly see that. Whether this Braque one, it seems like he's just working at all spaces at the same time. I have to say that it seems to be, maybe there's just more published unfinished Picassos, but there are not that many unfinished Braques that we found, so therefore, it's hard to tell. So here, again, my reconstruction is moving along as I speak. So this is the albino state. So it's these thin washes of highly diluted oil paint covering the charcoal, which is not fixed. So you can see it is smudging a little bit. And to make this process easier to visualize, I'm including these following paintings from my reconstructions. And while making them, it was very clear why Picasso asked for all of his white paint. It is really, really incredible how much white paint goes in there to build up these layers and to create this very thick impasto, which you can see in the exhibition. It's very remarkable. I also learned that these paintings cannot be painted in one sitting, since some layers need to be touch dry, at least touch dry, not completely dry, before applying the next one. And a good example is this intriguing looking little brush swoop here, which, you know, you cannot paint while this gigantic white impasto is still drying. So after a day or two, I was able to put it on there without it mixing with the underneath layer. Personally, most importantly, I think that lots of the effects were kind of created accidentally. And I think if you would ask them again to do it, I think it would be very hard even for them to mimic certain effects. I mean, this does not mean that they were not good painters. I think some of them were accidental things that happened. So again, one more time to recap, you have the charcoal underdrawing, the albino states, and then several different layers of buildup to reach the final product. So these Signac-style bricks described in Picasso's letter to Braque was something they adopted, obviously, from Paul Signac, which you can see in this slide. And as we already saw, they used this type of application in their drawings, their paintings, but also sort of in their prints and in their watercolors. And when we focus in more on their painted surfaces, as I completely agree with Christina Poggi's talk, we should really look closely without upsetting the guards upstairs. They are really beautifully painted, and you know, you'll see later what we had done in the Kimbell. We really tried to encourage people to do look at them a bit longer and try to find these different paint outs. So these paint outs we made and were actually shown in the galleries, and by isolating them, we were trying to show people what these techniques were, and in order for the people to actually find them in the real paintings. So you see an example here for wet over dry. So obviously the ground layer needs to be dry before you put the wet over it. This is what will happen if you paint when it's still wet. And then next to it we see nice examples from paintings. And then here are some other ones, a nice isolated example of scraping, which we found in our Braque, and then blending here, which is very clear there. And then another painting technique they adopted from another artist was passage. As we have already seen, Cézanne blended two neighboring shapes together so that they became one. Yeah, we can see in the houses and just everywhere almost. And then in this rather early Braque, a good example. So that's the one I used, not this painting, but an earlier Braque, because it was very hard to make that clear in a very symmetric reconstruction. So we decided to put in a little bit more elaborate painting to explain this technique. It is important to point out that not all of these techniques were that shockingly different than the techniques used in academic painting of the time. Picasso and especially Braque did add some innovations, and we all know them by now. So Braque introduced the insertion of sand. I think this one will help. So this is a microscope image of still life with banderias. It very clearly shows sand. And, well, that was a fun one to imitate, but it doesn't show very well. We just threw some sand in the paint. And then Braque also came up with the idea to integrate stenciled letters, a technique he probably knew from his earlier painter-decorator days. Needless to say that Picasso would soon follow him and started including letters in his own paintings. So you see here an obvious way of how you can apply a stencil. The wood graining or faux bois technique was introduced by Braque, I think, in 1911. And this technique was definitely something he had picked up while working as a decorator. With this technique, you can see it in this slide, a metal comb gets pulled through the still wet paint to create the illusion of the wood grain. And you can probably guess what I'm going to say next. Picasso found out of Braque's experimentations with the combs to create this interesting texture, and he had one purchased for him. Picasso did not only just copy the faux bois, but he used the texture in hair and beards in his portraits. And then 1912, it was probably the year when industrial paint was first introduced to Cubism. And we need to give credit where credit is due. This time, I think it was Picasso who came up with the industrial enamel paint Ripolin, which kind of now became a synonym for that paint, but there were plenty of other enamel-like paints. I think he liked the fact that it was adding brightness and shine to his black pigments. It also, more importantly, I think he liked the fact that it made the paint dry faster once it was mixed with other paints, and it also dried as a flat, glossy surface. And very interesting, that was free of brush strokes. So when Braque first saw Picasso's enamel paintings, he said, quote, "The weapons have changed," end quote. So Picasso wrote about the use of this industrial paint in a letter dated June 17, 1912, quote, "Perhaps we'll manage to disgust everybody, and we still won't have said it all," end quote. I just think that's just really interesting that they were really trying to kind of upset things. Finally, I'm showing the same photos Claire showed. We get to the varnish layer, or better, the lack thereof. And it's probably not very clear here in this photo of the reconstruction, but it was very clear in the reconstruction because I exaggerated quite significantly. But you can see how these black lines are just so much warmer and are really jumping at you compared to these. This side was varnished and this one was not. So we included that as well. So once it is varnished, as Claire said, it's hard to recreate the original surface. You can remove it again, you can try to extract it, but it is very hard to do. And as Claire already mentioned, several have been cleaned for the show, and I hope tomorrow for the study day that Laura Rivers will be here and she can talk herself about her real transformation with the Menil Picasso. I think that painting just, because we saw it during cleaning, and it's a different painting. It's really beautiful. The only problem with reversing these varnished paintings into unvarnished ones again is there is the danger that some areas might have been locally varnished, which is really hard to tell which one those are, because now it is kind of, it's all on or it's all off, and we don't really know where it was partially on. So I hope that both in Claire and my part of the lecture, we did shed some light on the way these Cubist paintings were created and how they're supposed to look as intended by the artist, and how many of them have been altered by conservation treatment. I think it's clear that Picasso and Braque were very close to each other in this period between 1910 and 12, both personally and technically. Their artistic relationship was extremely intense, and although Braque came up with most of the innovations, it was Picasso who took the proverbial ball and ran with it. So this is what you won't see in the exhibition. And this is the conservation room I talked about. This was added together with the iPad app, again, to encourage people to stand still just that tiny bit longer to really try to understand and mostly enjoy these really wonderfully painted paintings. So Claire and I encourage you to do that in the exhibition, and thank you.
Well, I'm nominally responding here. I'm certainly not refuting anything. But while we readjust, I'd like to thank both Bart and Claire, not only for their talks and essays, which were extremely illuminating, but also for your conservation work, which is clearly invaluable. And Bart, I think you've got a good career there as a Cubist forger if this conservation thing doesn't work out. Did I miss this? What are you going to do with the man with the pipe? Have you decided that yet?
This is on.
So
I'm hoping to benefit from the discussion tomorrow. I know that I'm inclined to reverse the lining and to reframe it, but I would also like to draw a lot of you all into that discussion.
Okay.
Because I do think it gets a little confusing, especially when I talked about, how Picasso liked flaking and, added craquelure. I really don't think he lined the painting to that. But given the fact that it does look that way, would he have minded? I don't know.
Right.
I mean, the easy way out would be to frame it in a frame with spandrels.
Right.
And that would probably be the easiest and maybe most safest thing to do.
Right, and just leave the old lining on? Sorry.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Because we have photos of the painting without the signature. So the signature is original, but was added later.
Okay, and
So
you're speculating at the same time that it was relined, maybe? Okay.
Yeah, we took x-rays of the painting, and we cannot find the signature on the back, which is not uncommon because they're mostly not painted with lead white, so they wouldn't show up in the x-ray anyway. But that would be nice to know whether he did sign it on the back.
Right.
So it adds just an extra layer to the discussion whether it should be reversed or not.
Right.
Because maybe his signature was kind of a way of approving the lining, even if he didn't maybe know it was lined at the time when it was given to him to re-sign it on the front.
Right,
So that just adds an extra layer of complication.
right.
I'll just add one other. When I was looking at other examples of Cubist paintings that Picasso did sign on the front this morning, I wondered, are those lined or unlined paintings? So that would be another interesting point to investigate.
Right, that's great. I'm just going to make a few comments here, and I promise you I'm restraining myself. I have quite a whole list, but I think it would be abuse of my position here, my hold on the microphone, because I'm sure a lot of you have questions too. But I wanted to go back to this question of the frame. So, and I was intrigued by the thought that Braque preferred the frames that effectively made an object out of the painting, pushing it forward, and that Picasso seemed to have this fondness for the kind of ornate, bourgeois, domestic interior sort of a frame, and that seemed to be interestingly, maybe counterintuitive, but intriguing fact nonetheless. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that yourself, or
Just that I think this is a really important area of investigation that we often overlook. And it's, and having worked in a museum for a long time, and I think everyone in museums nowadays, we place much greater emphasis on the importance of frame and finding original or period frames. But I can think of many examples, even in my own work, where we know what the original frame is, and taste still enters into it.
Yeah.
Trustees like it this way. We have a painting by Turner painted on a square panel, but it is a tondo, and the pendant is in Belfast in its original frame, framed as a tondo. But we framed it both ways at the Kimbell. I'm always in the camp saying it should be framed as a tondo, but a lot of people disagree. So I don't think that we'll ever win the battle of seeing every Cubist painting in the kind of frame Braque or Picasso would have chosen, but I do think we have a responsibility to present the information.
Right.
And I just think it's interesting when you have such a groundbreaking exhibition as the one at MoMA, and then in 1989, and that was the very moment when so many paintings were reframed.
Right.
So I think this is still an area that I think deserves a lot more attention.
Right, right.
Yeah, and maybe not as much for Picasso and Braque, but I think in general, sometimes an original frame might not mean what the artist actually liked.
Right.
Because sometimes they just didn't have money for the frame they really liked, and sometimes a dealer would just throw everything. I think it happened a lot with Impressionists that were shipped to America. They were just put in frames, and they are considered original frames, but I don't think any Impressionist wants to see the painting in one of those American dealer frames. But
Right.
it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, yeah.
But nevertheless, and I know the photographs were often staged, but when you do see those photographs of Picasso and Braque in their studio, in both cases, you do see evidence of frames and paintings in frames. So and I think we do know something about their intentions.
Right, that's great. And this has also made me very eager for the Scholars' Day tomorrow to look at these in your company. But the still life with glasses and bottle by Braque that has those really odd magentas and violets in the upper right and upper left. Anything? You didn't do any paint analysis on that or anything that?
We didn't. You're talking about the Eichholz painting?
Yeah.
Yes, and that is unfortunately the one painting, major painting that we didn't have a chance to examine directly. And curiously enough, I think I can say it is it's the one painting that had the most color in it that I can think of. So
a painting that is still got the varnish on it, which was,
Oh, is
we
that?
did also entertain that as a possibility, as trying to convince the owner to allow Claire to remove the varnish. But she was not interested in pursuing that at this time.
Right. Huh.
so
Okay.